Following 2 months of discussion and debate, the sale of the San Diego Union-Tribune and the Los Angeles Times to billionaire Dr. Patrick SoonShiong is expected to close on Monday, April 16th. The $500 million sale follows years of conflict between the Los Angeles Times and its former parent company, Tronc. That paper saw frequent changes in management, and Tronc remained the subject of bad news. In mid-March, Michael Farrow, the biggest shareholder in Tronc, stepped down as the company chairman, just hours before the publication of a Forbes story in which 2 women accused him of inappropriate sexual advances. The news came after NPR reported in January that the Times' former publisher, Ross Levinson, had been the defendant in sexual harassment lawsuits. In San Diego, there was more stability in the newsroom and tensions were not as high. Still, both the Union-Tribune and the Los Angeles Times have shared services with Tronc, and the terms of how the split will work is still being worked out. Tronc has shed more than 1,400 employees, nearly a fifth of the workforce at its legacy papers. The Times newsroom in January overwhelmingly voted to unionize to try to preserve jobs. Plans were in the works to cut up to 20% of the Times staff and close its Washington, D.C. bureau, Soon-Shiong told the Times, news that spurred him to act as desperately fast as possible to save the paper. Yet, the largest question is how the ownership of Patrick SoonShiong will change journalism in Southern California. Let's dive into who this new owner is and what it means for you. I'm Daniel Wheaton, and this is Refocus. In early April, features writer John Wilkins had the chance to sit down with Patrick SoonShiong. During the interview, you'll hear some ambient noise, but here is SoonShiong's remarks.
Ask you first about the letter you sent us and talked about newspapers being in your blood, and maybe you could sort of amplify on
a little bit
for me.
Yeah, so it is in my blood, literally. So as what may be very surprising that because I grew up in South Africa, the country did not have TV until I was 23 years old.
Okay.
So my entire life, I grew up on radio and newspaper.
Okay.
So my only form of both information, entertainment, education, sports was through the newspaper and the radio, which today you call podcasts.
Uh-huh.
So from that perspective, the fact of having twice a day actually, paper in your hands was an important element of our lives.
Okay. Oh.
But it extended to the point that, when I was, as I grew up, one of the things that I did in order to pay my way through college was to sell newspapers, but not in a normal way. I would literally go to the printing press and sit at the printing press as the papers were coming off and capture about 800 papers a day with a team, and we'd run through the city.
And this was where?
Port Elizabeth, South Africa.
Okay.
So that's how I grew up.
Now, were there specific examples from growing up where you remember the newspaper being especially crucial to uncovering some injustice
Well, remembering we were growing up in today being today was it yesterday, 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King. We were growing up, and I was watching these videos today of what happened 50 years ago in this country. We were growing up very much in that kind of environment, right? So I grew up in an environment of apartheid, and we had a South African government that was incredibly, it was basically an autocratic government. And the newspaper editors were taking their lives in their hands. And I looked at the LA Times or the San Diego Tribune. Purpose of a newspaper is speaking truth to power. And they spoke truth to power and took their lives in their hands, frankly. So one of the editors, his name is Donald Woods, in East London, and my wife grew up in East London and would sort of take on the government and they were put on a house arrest, right? And it was part of their. His two children were sent two T-shirts laced in acid by the secret police. So, so the newspaper was a form of resistance to the daily lives, especially the English-speaking newspaper. Mm-hmm. So it was more than a newspaper. It was what I see today as a fourth estate, right? And a real important part of our lives.
Okay. So tell me why you wanted to buy these papers.
Well, I think it's exactly what it is, more than anything else, right? It is a form of protecting democracy, right? If you look at, especially today, now that you hear what's going on at Facebook and even at Google, if you look at what I call the dark side of technology, and Robert Kaplan did a fantastic piece in an op-ed, I forget which paper, which really speaks very specifically to the dark side of technology. And I think you did a little tour, maybe, that we live and breathe technology as part of what I do in healthcare on the world of genomics. And so you could use technology for real good things, which we hopefully do, where you can do predictive modeling to ensure that you can find the right treatment for the patient for cancer. Or you could do predictive modeling to figure out what you're going to buy, your next sports jacket or your next suit or your next dress. Or who you're going to vote for or not vote for.
Right.
And I think this is where the newspaper could actually stand as an industry. And you call it a paper, but we're really a media, in a sense, and the opportunity to get real, truthful, honest news out is an important contribution that we think we can make. Because we're so steeped and live and breathe and not fearful of technology, we believe that it's very important to actually bring this technological expertise, not for the generation of the news, but for the distribution of the news.
Okay.
And it's a very big difference, a very big, important difference. Because at the end of the day, news, you're moving bits around and you're now taping me, and there should be no reason why this report that you're going to now type should not be a podcast as well, of exactly what I'm just saying. And I think that will be as of interest to the reader. So I see today publishing as merely a form of media, whether it be print, digital print, mobile print, web-based print, sound, podcast, or long forms of documentaries, as an opportunity for us as institution, you call it a newspaper, which at the end of the day is truthful, honest, fair news, or news of interest, being distributed in these different forms. In the world of technology, it's merely moving bits around. But at the end of the day, the content is what's important, and newsrooms generate the content. So that's a subtle way of looking at this, and we have an opportunity. We're building this infrastructure to share this with the nation. There are hundreds of independent newspapers now sort of failing. And I think that is a disaster, because I think those are national treasures of speaking truth to power.
Okay. So do you have can you share with us any of your immediate plans for when you become owner of the papers?
Go to SeaWorld? No, I'm kidding.
Go to the zoo?
Well, look, I think one of the things is to revisit and ask the question is, why is the value of this important news, why is the value of journalistic strength and good stories, quality stories of interest, not being appropriately valued? And is it just because we've actually been taken advantage of, so to speak? Mm-hmm. I don't know other words, in the sense of not actually generating the value upstream. It's interesting to think that Facebook is a large media company generating large amount of news for which they do not do the work to actually get the news.
They don't do the content.
Correct. So how do we change that model?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I'm going to do is really explore and learn how to go and fix that model. With regard to the organization between San Diego and LA Times, I think it's very important that news is local. I live in LA, but I have great affinity and depth of knowledge of what goes on in San Diego. I've worked for years and years and years with the Burnham Research Institute. We have a large research facility in Torrey Pines. So I think what's amazing about San Diego is it has this amazing biotechnology strength that has not been, and health and life sciences strength emphasized. It has really important messages as it relates to immigration, because it's sitting right there at the heart of the immigration issues. It has these military campuses that the training sites around. So it captures an area of demographics that is important to not only the nation but all of California. And those stories, important stories, need to come through. So I think what I want to do is ensure that both LA Times and San Diego look upon itself as citizens of the community, but then citizens of California, and then citizens of the nation. So that's what I'm trying to do, learn each organization.
So it sounds like your interest, the emphasis on local news means you see the rationale for keeping both of the newsrooms healthy?
Absolutely. And not only healthy, right? We need to thrive.
Okay.
So they need to thrive and regenerate, and understand. Unfortunately, it's a business still, because without the ability to invest and sustain,
right?
You really go. So the one way to sustain is to figure out how you can create the valuable content that you create to be published, is a better way to say it, in different media. Now that's very different from taking the concept of artificial intelligence and somehow generating content.
Right.
I think that's a silly way of thinking of it.
Okay.
But if you take technology from a perspective of saying, look, we can generate from that and put that into the DNA of the newsroom, that as you're doing the story of me now, for example, and you're recording me, how could you use that material in a way? And he's taking a photograph, and we have some Pulitzer Prize photographers. You have a Pulitzer Prize cartoonist. And I hope he doesn't do a cartoon of me, but he's welcome to. So why wouldn't we actually put all these pieces to work in, not that I want to ask you to do stop motion animation, but, we could really think about all these kinds of things, right? We sit in a city of the state of entertainment in Los Angeles and San Diego and California. We should have, meaning LA Times and San Diego Tribune and Espanol and all the other community papers that we have the ability to actually publish in these disparate ways. But what has not been put in place is an infrastructure to enable that and make that a seamless, almost knee-jerk, inherent thought processes of every reporter or journalist columnist.
Now you spent a lot of money to buy these papers. Are you hoping for a return on that investment, or do you see the papers more as sort of a public trust kind of thing?
Well, look, it's clearly a public trust, and it's not a philanthropic venture.
Okay.
Right? Because if it's a philanthropic venture, I'd make a grant and hope you do well.
Uh-huh.
It's really a venture to actually invest and create sustainability.
Okay.
Because in order to be a public trust, you really need to create public sustainability. And the Catholic nuns taught me no money, no mission. And it's true.
Right.
So I think we did pay a lot of money. I think it is clearly worthwhile investment in the impact we can make for the common good.
Okay. So, and I remember one of the letters you sent us as well talked about making sure the newspapers have the resources they need to thrive. Do you see yourself investing in the newsrooms immediately, or take some time to assess it first?
No. There's an immediate need for an infrastructure revamp.
Okay.
I've gone to the printing presses.
Okay.
I've lived printing presses since the age of 14, so I understand the printing presses. And I've looked at and I'll say it openly, our mobile app is terrible.
Uh-huh. Okay.
It's not a user experience that I could enjoy.
Uh-huh. Some people feel the same way about our websites. Yeah. So.
And look, it's not being critical. The organization has not had the commitment of investment. It's been, as I said, in this down spiral with multiple publishers, multiple owners. We see this as a long-term generational commitment, multi-generational commitment. So I see an opportunity for us to be very thoughtful, but there's clearly going to be a need for immediate infrastructural investment.
Okay.
There's going to be a need for me to find the best editorial staff, and I mean the best in many ways, both young and seasoned. We need to have, I think there was a good story that came out today in the New York Times about the youngs and the olds, as they call it. I'm not sure.
I haven't had a chance to read that yet.
Yeah, you should.
Okay.
I think it's a real good story. It just came out about how the New York Times is struggling with the young editorial staff and the old guard.
Okay.
I'm of the old guard. I get that. I'm not of the young. So I respect experience. You can only have experience with experience. I don't know else have you get experience.
Right.
And you can only have good judgment after having some experience. But you also need some vitality, and you also need to understand how this millennial generation actually consumes information.
Right.
Whether Court says it by text now. And so, and most kids don't watch TV any longer, and it's either on the computer or by podcasts. So when you say, are you going to invest there? Absolutely. But you're going to invest across looking at revitalizing, but adding, but not denigrating the incredible value of experience and good judgment and good storytellers. Right.
I wanted to ask you, go back to the San Diego, LA question, just because there's always been some sensitivity in San Diego about being big-footed by LA.
Like the San Diego Chargers?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good recent example of LA stealing our football team. Yeah. So what would you say to the readers in San Diego to sort of maybe comfort them in the notion that this is just going to be an LA-centric operation with us sort of as a satellite?
Yeah, and absolutely not. Look, San Diego is an important city, right? It has, as I said, its strengths that LA does not have, right? it is a community in its own right with its own vibe and feel. People living in San Diego would never want to live in LA, and some people and vice versa. And so we need to tell the stories that are important to that community. So this is not an LA-driven San Diego paper, if that's the concern. It cannot be, because that would defeat the purpose. Having said that, San Diego, LA, Santa Barbara, all of a sudden we are California. And there are times where we should act as Californians on behalf of the nation, because Californians lead always. We've led throughout. It's the 6th largest economy. I looked at the California demographics. The median age is 34 years. So we should figure out how we can provide a message on behalf of California in all our papers. So some stories that are written by Los Angeles reporters have pertinence to San Diego and vice versa. And somehow we should actually, because of the difficulties in the industry, create synergies. But the synergies of good content. But it doesn't mean you're subverting one over the other. Does that answer some of that concern? But I recognize that as a concern, and that's why we're coming down and meeting directly with the San Diego team. But then you'll have the size and scale and breadth of a large demographic to create the back-end infrastructure for all of us.
Now you mentioned bringing in the best editorial talent. Do you anticipate making any changes in the editorial leadership in either of the papers?
In San Diego, I've met with your editor, and Jeff Light, and I think he's done a fantastic job. And clearly, the editorial staff in San Diego, I think, has thrived even under difficult circumstances. The editorial staff in Los Angeles, as you know, has gone through multiple changes.
Right.
So my job in Los Angeles first is to ensure that we get an editor-in-chief of the most excellent skills, journalistic skills, reputation, integrity, honesty, and if we can, diversity. Right. So that's what we're looking for. And as I said, I think it's going to have to be a thoughtful decision that I will make, and upon making that decision, we'll then address the issue of publishing.
Okay. How hands-on of an owner do you see yourself being in terms of the editorial product? Not just the news, but even on the editorial page?
No, on the editorial product itself, in terms of the... I see the newspaper in sort of 3 buckets.
Okay.
So the editor-in-chief will report the news, and the news has to be the news. It is what it is. It's honest, it's fair, it's truthful, and unvarnished, untainted by any interference by anybody, including the owner. But then there's the op-ed page, which is opinion, and I suppose, rightly or wrongly, anybody can have an opinion.
They do.
And as long as it's exposed as an opinion and read as an opinion, whether right or left or middle, or an opinion about anything, the right to try, for example, is an issue of life or death issues, and there's opinions on both sides. I think that op-ed editor should be completely separated from the editor-in-chief from the newsroom. And that op-ed editor traditionally reports to the publisher. And I think that organizational structure should stay in place, because that's how New York Times runs it, and that's how Washington Post runs it. And then there's this thing called the LA Times Studio, which I believe is this next generation media of just finding a new way of taking these content and publishing it in a new way. Where it'd be, as I said, verbal, oral, podcast, documentary, short-form video, but be based on, if it's news, unabridged news, or based on opinion. That's how I sort of see the structure.
Okay. And do you see yourself as the publisher?
At this point, I see myself as the owner.
Okay.
Right? And I see myself as an owner with fresh eyes.
Okay.
Trying to learn as much as I can.
Right.
From people with grey hair that have been there and done that. So I met with people like Don Graham.
Okay. Uh-huh.
I've met with people like Tom Jordan. I've met with people like Al Hunt. Judy Woodruff, and Norm Pilstein, to get their views, and Anne-Marie Lipinski, who's at the Newman Foundation, to get their views of how do I go about ensuring that these institutions are strong and stand for what they should be, which is, as I said, speaking truth to power and having a complete level of independence, but also to find levels of truthfulness, honesty, fairness, and integrity, which I really feel is so key. And how do they sort of see this industry evolving? Them having sort of witnessed the struggles of the last decade, right? And so it's been a decade struggle. It has not been an overnight failure. And by that I don't even see that the word failure is the wrong word. It's not the overnight difficulties, because I think it's just not the sufficiently rapid transition to technology as it's evolving, what I call this fourth industrial revolution. And we happily in healthcare, at least in Nant Health and our organization of Nant Works, have taken on the task of saying we need to evolve healthcare very rapidly into this fourth industrial revolution. And how do we then use this insight of just moving bits in another industry? So that's how I've sort of gone out trying to learn from the people that are out there.
Right. Are there what newspapers do you read regularly today?
Well, let me tell you what I used to read.
Okay.
Regularly. I would regularly read the Wall Street Journal, and I would regularly read the LA Times and the New York Times. And Economist.
Okay.
And then scientific journals, right?
Okay.
I've now picked up so that I can understand what we're publishing in the San Diego Tribune, the mobile apps of the Los Angeles Times, and even look at the, as we launch Hoy, right, and the LA Times Espanol, or En Espanol. Not that I can speak Spanish, but my wife can better than I. So, again, there's an opportunity where you can take LA Times En Espanol and not consider it a Hispanic newspaper. It's a newspaper where you can create an opportunity to truly create immersion, integration, but also respect the language, where you could put both Spanish and English in the same paper. That's one of the things I want to explore, where it becomes an educational tool for children to be able to read both languages inside the newspaper. I don't see why we don't have a thing called the Children's Corner, where the newspaper is an educational tool as well as an entertainment tool.
Are there any newspaper owners out there who in your research and taking on these papers that you particularly admire?
Well, I think the Chandlers did amazing, obviously,
Okay.
right? I mean, if you look at what they built from Daily Times, they actually built a city, frankly. The Grahams, as I said to you, I met with Don Graham and understand what they did when they built the Washington Post. I've not met with the Salzburgers and any other owners, but I think between the Chandlers and the Grahams, if you create that kind of impact and legacy, the McCormicks did amazing things for Chicago,
right?
And they still continue to do through the McCormick Foundation. So between these, so you ask yourself, what's the common denominator amongst them? They're basically families that have taken this on as institutional value to the community and built this on behalf of the community rather than any profit-based, private equity-run system. Not that there's anything wrong with that from a capitalist perspective, but for this kind of institution, I always say I see this as a public service in the private sector. And I really mean that. I think this is a public service in the private sector.
Okay. So you're part of a wave of recent people who've bought newspapers from coming in from other worlds first. Have you had a chance to talk with, for example, Jeff Bezos from the Washington Post?
No, I've not.
Okay.
Especially since the last few days, I've not had a chance to talk to him. But I think what he's doing, he's actually brought his technology platform through AWS, and he's built this ARC publishing system, which he's sharing with other newspapers. So in a light mind, he's sort of taken what he knows as a great skill set and his technology, and raised the app, the mobile app platform for most newspapers.
So I wanted to ask you about the last 3 ownership changes we've had in San Diego have been met almost immediately by layoffs for newspapers. Do you anticipate that happening after you take ownership?
No, we don't anticipate that happening at all, right? I mean, you have 250 people. It's hardly an opportunity to do any layoffs of 250 people.
Okay.
So I think you can assure your team that's not going to happen.
Okay.
Now, clearly, I have to respect whatever the editor currently is there.
Right. Now, so an editor, Jeff Light, is our editor and publisher.
Correct.
And you mentioned earlier sort of an ideal format would be a separation between editor and publisher. Do you anticipate severing those jobs in San Diego?
I don't think so in San Diego, because you're really a smaller team with a smaller... and right now, I don't want to disrupt what's been working well.
Okay.
Right? I think in Los Angeles, the editor and publisher was always separated. And rightly so. And they are the market equivalent size of the New York Times, and so I met with Dean Baquet and I met with Marty Barron. I didn't meet with him directly, but I spoke to them. And got their insight on how they run their newsroom relative to the publisher and the op-ed editor, and they both felt that's how it works well for them.
Okay. So tell me what similarities and connections you see between this world, the medical world, and the media world. I mean, you look on your website, Network's website, and there's, I think, the word that appears under every different thing is knowledge. So obviously the media there's a lot of knowledge in the media world. What are the connections you see?
So if you look at the website, what we're trying to do as an organization is transform how we work, live, and play. So when you look at the newspaper, you're affecting everybody's life as it relates to how they work, live, and play. And if you look at a journalist and you look at a scientist that's trying to do discovery, and that whole building and the building across the street that's being built and people downstairs below us, all they are is about discovery. And discovery about the unknown and discovery about the known. That's what the journalists are. They are about looking and doing discovery. They're looking for the facts, and that's what journalists are, and that's what the scientists are. They love to publish, and that's what scientists do. They love to publish, and that's what journalists do. They live for the bylines and to publish. Sometimes you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong, and if you get it wrong, you sort of fix it.
Try to fix it, right?
And I see that no different. What was important is to the scientists is the value of the recognition of their work. I think journalists have not been respected. I think that's where owners, at least we as a new owner, I've lived my entire life valuing the value of somebody generating new knowledge as a scientist, and somebody generating new information and new truthful knowledge as a journalist should be valued and respected in that same way. So I see very great similarities. What we're doing as Scientific Insight here, we're moving so that we can get our information all the way onto the website, all the way into what we call document exchange, all the way into mobile platforms,
Right.
so that both consumer, payer, farmer can get this knowledge. I think we need to move the newspapers into that direction.
So what do you do when you're not working? Is there such a thing?
I don't think this is work, actually.
Okay.
So that's the beauty of what I do in here. Is
Okay.
I don't perceive it as work. I perceive it as just satisfying my insatiable curiosity and just
Okay.
continue to do what I do.
So, but do you have any hobbies?
But I play basketball.
Yeah, that's what
I
I
played
hear.
foot court last night.
You played full court last night? For how long?
A couple of hours.
Oh boy,
Yeah.
that's good exercise.
Yeah, that's what we do. So that's my solace. I go into a world where I can just turn off and play basketball.
So are you a three-point shooter or do you go to the basket?
No, I'm both.
Both? Oh boy.
That's pretty good for you, so.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm a shooting guard.
Okay. Shooting guard. Okay. And so I have your age is 65. Are you still 65? Or have you had a birthday?
I'm still 65. I'm maybe 60 now, but I'm still 65.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you just what you're comfortable telling me about your politics. People will want to know in San Diego. We had Douglas Manchester owned the paper.
Yeah.
Before the trunk company did, and he was very sort of aggressive in his political positions and put them into the newspaper that way. Do you anticipate?
No, well, my
pushing
politics
forward your
is
own political-
very straightforward, right?
Okay.
I don't look at issues as left or right.
Okay.
I truly look at issues as very pragmatically, how will it affect another human being? And I put myself in the shoes of the other human being, of the other issue, and mostly in the shoes as if I'm a physician. So if you put yourself as a physician, I don't look at you as a patient. I'm going to help you if you're Democrat or Republican,
Okay.
if you have cancer,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So you need to think, I think of life in that way. And so I look towards politicians who will actually accomplish something. Now, sadly, there are a lot of politicians who say that what they're going to say and never do what they say. And very quickly I find out who they are. And I don't support them whether right or left on the basis of merely being a politician. I think if you're going to be a politician, it's an amazing opportunity of public service.
Right.
But it's a public service opportunity where you are put in a position of great power to affect millions of lives. So I support the right, and I support the left, and I support the middle, as long as they're going to make an impact that is truly, truly, truly for the common good. So I don't know what you call that.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm registered as an independent,
Okay.
and I mean that. So I'll support a Republican, and I'll support a Democrat, and I'll support an independent if they truly mean what they say and do something which I think will affect the common good.
Okay. Now you met with current President Trump during his transition period. What can you tell me about that? And was that?
Yeah, I can tell you. I met with him. What was the date in Bedminster?
20.
No, what, December?
Oh, it was December
2016, right?
15.
December
Yeah,
2016,
December 2016.
yeah. So he invited me to Bedminster
Okay.
and as well to the Trump Towers.
Uh-huh.
And I thought it was a great honor to be called in to share what my views were on healthcare.
Okay.
As you know, I shared my views with previous administrations, including the Obama administration, because I feel passionate that what we're doing in healthcare is unsustainable. I feel passionate the fact that we're spending $4 trillion and actually having some of the worst healthcare in developed nations in the world is ridiculous. I feel passionate that we actually have a solution to that. And he called me in to meet with him and his cabinet members to share my thoughts on that solution. And I must say, he gave me not only the time, he gave me access to the HHS secretary, to the finance budget committee people, the people that actually would have some input into how they would look at the issues facing healthcare.
Uh-huh.
And I believe, and I still do believe, they're very sincere about trying to understand this complex issue of healthcare.
Okay.
So that was that meeting, and I think it was an important meeting.
And have you been able to have further dialogue with people in the administration since that meeting?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I've had continued access and continued discussions on important subjects, and I think it's important for me to make my contribution of what I know in healthcare, and especially in cancer, right? I think I'm concerned about three things. One, cancer. I think I'm concerned about the things that's going to wipe out humanity.
Okay.
One is cancer. The other one, I think, is a lurking concern that nobody's really picking up on yet, is drug-resistant TB.
Okay.
With the immigrants going into Europe, there's going to be now an epidemic of drug-resistant TB.
Huh.
So what I call infectious diseases. As you begin to see, the influenza kills more people than people actually realize.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then the third one, obviously, down the road is Alzheimer's.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the areas in healthcare that if we can solve, create a solution for cancer, and if we can create a solution for infectious diseases and wipe us out, like drug-resistant TB, like drug-resistant staphylococcus, like HIV, like influenza, and if we can actually address issues on Alzheimer's. By the way, all 5 of these we have programs in. I'm happy to say. Mm-hmm. We have a vaccine now in trials for cancer. We have a treatment for drug-resistant TB. We're in clinical trials for latent HIV. Mm-hmm. We're in clinical trials for Alzheimer's. So I think these are the important issues that I want to put in front of the administration, that we as a nation can lead the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. So imagine using healthcare as a national security tool to export health as an advantage of not just intellect, know-how, but to the world. And I said this to the previous administration. Healthcare is an existential issue for both Russia and China. Mm-hmm. There's contamination, huge contamination in China. The incidence of lung cancer is going up exponentially, right, even in the pediatric area. The one-child policy has created the elderly population in Japan. You see the history there, the smoking and the elements going on even in Russia. If we had a solution to those kinds of problems, the type 2 diabetes in the Middle East is off the charts. Diabetes in China is off the charts. Populations would know that these are existential issues, and we have, as a country, had a solution. Put us in amazing more power than even the nuclear weapons that everybody has. So I think this current administration, previous administrations, if we took that opportunity and used that strength, and that's where, ironically, come back full circle to San Diego, right? So Ivor Royston was out there, and when you had the first antibody company was out in San Diego, and all the biologicals that's out there in San Diego. Because, by the way, these are all biologicals now in the world of biologicals in terms of pharmaceuticals. So how do you get this kind of very complex information all the way up to the halls of power of right, of Washington? I think is an important obligation, actually, that I have to serve, if called upon.
Okay. So I wanted to ask you, there have been over the years a number of things written about you, some of them not always laudatory.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the threads that I've seen through there is you described as someone who overpromises and underdelivers. How would you respond to that complaint about you?
Yeah, and it's a complaint that I recognize will come when you're dealing with areas that are on the cutting edge, right? You're dealing with areas of great complexity,
mm-hmm.
and you're dealing with areas where you're actually trying to force change. So when you're trying to force change, complexity, and cutting edge, and the people who will make comments like that who don't have a comfort level or understanding, I don't know which of the two,
mm-hmm.
I have empathy for people making those kinds of comments because it is what it is. That they understand, and I think the only way to really judge is to look at the outcomes, to look at the data, to look at what have we accomplished.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very proud of when they said it was impossible to make the first protein nanoparticle.
Mm-hmm.
That this is the only drug now that has now been approved worldwide for breast cancer, lung cancer, pancreatic cancer, and made a change in lives. Mm-hmm. I'm really proud of the fact when they said it was impossible to take a human genome sequencing and put it into a machine and get results in 47 seconds. And in fact, we're now at 20 plus seconds.
Okay.
And in reality. So I think I take those comments with equanimity. It doesn't affect me in the sense that I go crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I try to actually reach out to people like that and explain what we're doing, right? But sometimes it's not possible.
Okay.
Just
Okay.
a quick time check. We have about 10 minutes.
Yeah. No, so I'm good. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about?
You want a podcast?
Was there anything else that you wanted to talk? Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you about. The name Nant.
Yeah. So Nant it's a good question.
It's from Apache.
Yeah. So he who speaks for the people. So Nantan.
Okay.
Nantan.
Uh-huh.
Is a Native American leader.
Okay.
And it translates to he who speaks for the people.
Okay.
But like all things, it could be whatever you want it to be, right? It could be neural artificial network. It could be nanotechnology. It could be new approaches to next therapies.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So, but it emanated from that.
Okay. Oh. It was a
and actually, it's an interesting byline for the newspaper, He Who Speaks for the People.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, in the masthead.
Right, it is.
He
right?
speaks for the people. Yeah. So I mean, you
want to change that to sending it?
Well, we've had some interesting ones over the years. But so
what is your masthead?
It doesn't really say anything anymore.
What did it say?
Well, when Mr. Manchester owned the paper, it was something like.
No, what does it say when it started? I'm talking about history. I know LA Times. I found this one says "Speaking Truth to Power."
Oh,
I love that.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what it said.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we used to say neither friend nor foe in our something. Yeah.
He who speaks with SeaWorld, or what?
Well, so now the Washington Post one is "Democracy Dies in Darkness." That's the Washington Post uses, which is a pretty good one too. But we don't have one. So.
What do you think about He Who Speaks with the People?
Well.
You want to go vote for that in the newsroom?
I like the Speaking Truth to Power one.
For both of us, right?
Yeah, that's a good one.
You found it? Speaking Truth to Power? LA Times?
Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about when you knew I was coming to chat with you?
No, I think, I think it's important for you and the folks down in San Diego to understand that we're not only going to be very, very supportive, you are truly a city and a paper that's important to the city and the paper. And I recognize that, and I'm going to come down and make sure that I understand the community.
Uh-huh.
And you know, as I said, we run our NanQuest down there in San Diego. So a company called NanQuest, which is the natural killer cell.
Do you see yourself being an active member of the San Diego community at all? I mean, you live here.
Yeah. I've been asked, and I will come down. Sadly, I'm spread a little thin.
Even before you bought the newspapers, I suspect you were spread a little bit.
I definitely will come down.
Okay.
And, UC San Diego is really important down there, and you host very important scientific medical conventions. The Palomar, which is it's close to San Diego, is a hospital we'll be working with.
Okay.
And the military bases are down there.
Right.
I work very closely with the Department of Defense.
Okay.
The naval bases I'm doing clinical trials with. So we have very direct interactions down there. I don't know if you consider Irvine, San Diego, close.
Well, it's different county, but it is closer.
But it's closer.
Yeah.
So
speaking of Orange County, do you have any interest in the Orange County Register now?
Well, I think it's struggling. I hear it's struggling, right? And look, I think, as I said, it'd be fantastic if we found a way of being a common voice for California, and Irvine, Orange County is again, it's an area completely different from San Diego and completely different from LA.
Right.
So it's important that a Orange County paper for its local content be there. But again, this is what happens when you don't have what I call critical mass, right?
Right.
You don't have sustainability.
Right.
So we would be interested from the perspective of helping sustainability.
Okay.
Not in an avaricious way to sort of just get another paper for the sake of another paper.
Okay.
Help?
Yes. Thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you.
John Wilkins, you had the chance to actually go in and meet Dr. Patrick SoonShiong. Why don't you describe what that day was like when you got to visit his offices?
Okay, so we went up last week to his headquarters in Culver City for NantWorks, which is the umbrella organization for this kind of interesting web of healthcare and diagnostic companies that he runs. And it's a pretty impressive place. They've got, I think, 20 genome sequencing machines, each costing north of $1 million, that are running data all the time. It's a big project of his as part of his effort to cure cancer. So then we got Eduardo Contreras, the photographer, and I got to spend about an hour with him in a conference room talking about his vision for the newspaper and some of that stuff.
Cool. And also you've had the chance to really look into this individual and kind of learn more about him. So why don't you tell us, what are some of the most interesting facts that you've learned about the story of Patrick SoonShiong?
Well, he has a very interesting background. He was born in South Africa in a coastal city called Port Elizabeth. His parents were Chinese immigrants who fled China when the Japanese invaded it during World War II. His doctor was kind of a village. So they lived in apartheid South Africa in a village that was pretty much designated just for Chinese immigrants. His father was kind of the village doctor and herbalist. So some of his earliest memories are of people knocking on the door with a cough or fever, and his dad would give him some kind of herbal concoction in an attempt to cure them.
Yeah, so he really has a history of medical care and caring for others, and that's kind of the theme of his life, it seems.
Yeah, it is, and he's very, very driven, even from a young age. Part of his interesting history concerns newspapers. He grew up again in South Africa, where television was banned until he was 23 years old. So he got almost all of his information and entertainment news from newspapers. And he was very, very driven. He graduated from high school at 16, finished medical school at 23, and was on his way from there.
Certainly impressive. So let's step back a little bit. On the day that you heard the news that the Union-Tribune and the Los Angeles Times were sold, what was your reaction? Well,
it was a surprise, but then not a surprise. This is, I think, the fifth ownership change in about a dozen years for us. So, that at some point, all the shoes that can drop have already dropped, it seems. So it wasn't quite as shocking to me as the first time that it happened was, but I knew a little bit about Dr. Soon-Shiong just because he was the second largest shareholder of Tronc, which owned the newspaper at the time. So, and he'd been in some loggerheads with Michael Farrow, who was the main player in Tronc at the time. So he was not an entirely unknown entity to me, but exactly why he wanted to buy us, in addition to the LA Times, was a little bit of a mystery.
Mm-hmm. And also, San Diego has many companies that have ties to Dr. Patrick SoonShiong, with all the biomedical fields and with the universities and the military. So even though he's not San Diegan, he still has plenty of ties here. So is there anyone that you've spoken to on the business end here in San Diego that can kind of give more light as to what this person is?
Yeah, so there are some people. Probably the guy who knows him the best in San Diego is a guy named Dr. Ivor Royston, who's an oncologist, just as Dr. Soon-Shiong is. And he's known him since, probably the early 1990s, and has had an interesting sort of trajectory with him. Mm-hmm. Early on, he was an investor in one of Dr. Soon-Shiong's companies, and now Dr. Soon-Shiong is an investor in one of his companies and sits on the board. So in kind of a He was his boss first, and now Dr. Soon-Shiong's his boss. And he says that that sort of ambition and drive and sort of big picture vision that Dr. Soon-Shiong is known for now, that was evident even in the early days. Mm-hmm. And he describes him as someone who's very calm, very focused, very long-term, somebody who's very collaborative in the projects that he takes on in San Diego. So he speaks very highly of him, but is also quick to point out that Dr. Soon-Shiong does things that rub sort of traditional researchers and doctors the wrong way sometimes, mm-hmm. because he pushes so hard to move things along that some people are not comfortable with some of his projections for the future and the speed at which he pursues things.
Mm-hmm. And also, as we have already listened to what Dr. SoonShiong had to say to you just a couple of weeks ago, he admits that he is connected to news and newspapers, but doesn't quite know all the intricacies. So, in your reporting, what do you feel like his vision for these two papers is going to be? Obviously, he's still forming it, but
he is forming it, and I think it's a interesting mix of his own passions and background. You know, part of it is very traditional newspaper speak. He talks about the newspapers having an essential role in the successful functioning of a democracy. He sees that as especially important in our current days. You know, just this week you have the Facebook hearings where people are all concerned about the way social media has been used in elections for misinformation. So he sees newspapers, robust journalism as an important bulwark to support democracy. At the same time, he's very much a technology guy. Mm-hmm. So I think his initial focus, we'll see with the newspapers, will be an investment in the infrastructure to enable the companies to move their content quickly and seamlessly out into the multiple platforms we're seeing that people want to use to consume their information now, including things like podcasts.
Yeah. He joked about this during the interview.
Several times he talked about this interview being a podcast. He saw no reason why it couldn't be.
Mm-hmm. And also, you've been at the Union-Tribune for some time, and you've seen it gone through a number of changes. So if you could have a wish for what could change in the world of John Wilkins, what would you hope the UT could be under a new leader with more funds?
Well, I would, I guess, point to a model like the Washington Post, where Jeff Bezos has come in, brought in extraordinary technological expertise from Amazon, and then has been mostly a hands-off publisher in terms of how the journalism is done. He recognizes that that's not his strength, and when I talk to Dr. Soon-Shiong, he recognizes that the content should be left to the people who know how to do that. Mm-hmm. He talked very openly about how the news is the news and that it needs to be presented without any interference from anybody, including the owner. So we'll have to see if that proves true or not. As you mentioned, I've been through a number of ownership changes here. I've been here 30 years now, and almost everybody who takes ownership of the paper says things similar to what Dr. Soon-Shiong is saying in terms of journalistic importance and integrity, although I think he talks about it at a level, has a sophisticated understanding of it that goes beyond a lot of some of our previous owners.
Mm-hmm. And it goes without saying that the political moment we are in is much different from when Trunk or Doug Manchester took over the UT, so perhaps there's a bit more of an onus to keep it from falling even further into disrepair.
Yeah, and I think I think we're also fortunate in that if he does want to go the Bezos route, he's got several examples, not just in Washington, but in Minneapolis and other places Boston, where wealthy owners with little to no background in journalism have come in and reinvigorated the products there. So.
Mm-hmm. And also, Dr. SoonShiong is visiting us in just a couple of days. But is there anything you're itching to ask him? You've already had the chance to ask some questions, but time has changed.
Yeah, not too much. I mean, I felt like I had a good chance to speak with him. He was not evasive in answering the questions that I wanted to ask him, although, as you know from our own staff meeting last Friday, people asked me questions about what I'd asked him that I had neglected to ask him. So I know there is some concern among some people about how the newspapers will be allowed to cover his many business interests. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, he does have some businesses in San Diego, and he is a significant player in the biotech world, which is a big part of San Diego's economy these days. So we'll just have to see how comfortable he is with people delving into those aspects of his empire.
Yeah, and it's not something that journalism has, not dealt with in the past. If you read an Amazon story from the Washington Post, it notes that Bezos is the owner, but had no interaction in the reporting. So we can just hope that it'll be a similar situation with us when we cover biotech here in San Diego.
Yeah, and certainly we'll have to. I wouldn't be surprised if the editors of this paper aren't already sort of talking about what kind of policy, what kind of language they'll insert into stories when we're writing about some of his holdings. But the questions Monday from the coming up from the staff will be interesting to watch. I think there remains some kind of concern and interest in finding out just how interested he is in San Diego. I mean, the LA Times clearly is what was most interested in rescuing. Yes. And so we came as part of that deal. And so I think in talking to him, he's fairly comfortable with the way things have been going here. And I suspect a lot of his energies early on will be directed in Los Angeles. Here's hoping for a successful and healthy change in ownership here.
Mm-hmm. John Wilkins, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
The news comes at an increasingly precarious time for journalism. The publishing industry has been struggling to hold subscribers in print and grow online, and advertisers are moving their dollars to Facebook, Google, and ad exchanges, and away from traditional media. In the past month, the Denver Post has taken a firm stance against its owner, Alden Capital, which has cut staff drastically during the past few years. And a Deadspin video showed local TV journalists at Sinclair broadcasting stations reading a script decrying mainstream media's bias, while their stations are forced to run commentary live. And things don't seem to be getting any easier at Trunk, now without its California properties. After the sale of San Diego and LA, Trunk President Tim Knight sent out a letter detailing a plan to revamp the remaining newspapers by flattening out the newsrooms and increasing the size of reporting teams. Additionally, centralizing the copy and design desks. Some Chicago staffers described this as the Trunk Hunger Games. Still, the Chicago Tribune staff responded with the unionization effort. And on Thursday, the centralized digital staff at Trunk was laid off, and the former Times editor-in-chief Louis Dvorkin was fired from his job as chief content officer for Trunk. Discussing the state of the media, here's opinion editor Matt Hall. So, Matt Hall, since we last spoke, there have been plenty of new events in relation to what's going on at the UT, as well as some national events that have really harmed the way that people perceive how the media is doing. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of the major controversies we've seen, particularly in Denver and nationwide with Sinclair?
Yeah, the Denver Post situation is fascinating to me. I mean, you had an editorial and I think about a half dozen or so op-eds, all of which ran in their Sunday newspaper, which you presume is their biggest circulation newspaper, that really took their owner to task. And that's something that you don't really see. I mean, first of all, the owner is often, as the publisher, the head of the editorial board. Mm-hmm. So often it's their vision that's kind of being presented in these editorials. But the editorial itself and then the accompanying commentary was really harsh about the owner and the bloodletting that's taken place at the Denver Post since they won a Pulitzer, I think 4 years ago. There's this image that a lot of people may have seen on the internet of this staff of all the people, kind of smiling because they've won this prestigious award. And then as a slider, you kind of slide over to today and you see that there's empty bodies there. And I think that the newsroom has been reduced from 250 to like 100 bodies or something like that. Mm-hmm. And so the editorial page editor and the board took it upon themselves to vilify the ownership, saying that if they want to do good journalism but don't want to commit to the staffing levels, then they should sell the paper, which you just don't see in an editorial, right?
Yeah, it's very damning.
And so it got a huge response. It was the most popular post on the Post site all day yesterday. Like journalist from Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, to others were just really holding them up as kind of a good example of something done right for journalism, which is taking a stand in a community. Yes, it was taking a stand for themselves, but doing it and making the point that journalism is important. It's at a precarious time for the industry and for a lot of newspapers. And, it's something that a drum that I've been banging for a year and a half, both through my involvement at the national level with the Society of Professional Journalists, and then locally in journalism circles, and here at the UT, which is, journalism costs money, less journalism costs society more. And I think that's the point that the Denver Post is making in its editorials by saying our staff is being decimated. We need to do something about it. So that's the stand that they took.
Mm-hmm. And in a sense, what is going on at the Post is kind of the worst possible situation for the UT had things gone differently. For instance, they're owned by a hedge fund, and now with the recent news, we are now owned by Patrick SoonShiong, an independent investor. So as we look forward, and in addition to what you're doing on the opinion team, what do you see as some things you're hoping that this new leadership will provide you, and also the vision for the paper?
I'd like 10 more people on the editorial board of a diverse background. Oh, that may not happen. Honestly, I hope that his the passion and the commitment that he's shown in a couple of emails that he sent the staff here will be kind of illustrated with his actions. So maybe he, it's funny because every other sale that we've been through in the last 5 years, it's like, oh man, how much are we going to lose? How many colleagues will we say goodbye to? How many beats will be forgotten? And here, I think at least me, and I think some others I've talked to in the building are cautiously optimistic that not only will we not cut to the bone, but that we may add some things. So I think that there's some excitement there. And I just hope that he realizes that our vision for the editorial board, separate from the news department, is a good one for San Diego. I think there's a lot of economies of scale and combinations and news reporting you can do by combining the LA and the San Diego teams, is because it's really one team now. But this is not going to be the San Diego Times, right? Yes. I mean, this is going to be the San Diego Union-Tribune. We're still going to be locals writing about the issues, both from the news perspective and on the opinion side of things. And so I hope that there's some kind of a realization that is a good thing too, that there is some things we can combine, but then that the LA Times and the San Diego Union-Tribune see the world through the editorial board through different prisms. Mm-hmm.
And also, as someone who is very public-facing, interacts with the public on a daily basis, hearing all the criticisms of the UT, what are you feeling from the people? Are they hopeful as we are with the new owner?
There's criticism of the UT? That's news to me. No. Yes, there is criticism of the UT. A lot of it, some of it justified. And I'm always willing to, like you say, I'm the public face. I think a lot of the people here use Twitter very well. I use it kind of addictively. I'm on it a lot, and I do like to respond to critics and hear what they have to say. And I do think this is an opportunity for us to, I don't know if to answer your question directly, I'm not sure if they share our excitement or optimism. Some of the people that I've talked to, we've kind of seen this show before. And so I think that they're like, oh, here we go again. I think there's a sense of that. But I also think, we talked about other newspapers' ownership issues and Sinclair, which we didn't really get into, but that whole thing where ownership is again on the TV side of things, kind of sticking their nose into the news side and pushing some views in maybe ways that are inappropriate. And so I think that Patrick will probably want to get involved, and I think his involvement, we'll see how involved he is. But I do think that people are I would assume that people are cautiously optimistic, because we've seen the Doug Manchesters of the world. We've seen Platinum Equity, which was kind of an investor, kind of like what the Denver Post is seeing. And, they're like squeezing water from a stone. They're trying to cut the staff to levels that it probably shouldn't be cut. And so I think we'll see. I think the community, though, is eager for someone who seems smart and passionate and committed to journalism, and the timing is good for us, because just this year, the UT started this big push for media literacy, where we have a bunch of reporters and journalists at the UT and at other outlets in town and other journalism organizations actually going into the community and trying to deal with some of these issues we've been talking about and rebuild trust. This is something that newspapers should have done a long time ago. Go into the community and say, here's the difference between an editorial and a newspaper story. Here is how we value, here's how we create news stories. This is our definition of real news, right? I always talk about fake news. I think if we can all agree on what real news is, then we don't have to talk about fake news. And that is kind of what we're doing with these pushes. And I think that Patrick will like what he sees there, because I think that is core of a newspaper's mission, is to be in the community and talk about what makes a better San Diego. We might all disagree politically about that, but I think we can all agree that a diversity of viewpoints and taking everyone's concerns seriously and trying to be responsible journalists is important.
Mm-hmm. And also, what are some of the points of confusion that you hear when you give this talk to people? I know you've gone to colleges, you've given it to community groups. What are people confused about when it comes to reading a product like the UT?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it varies depending on the audience and how they get their news. It's funny, first thing I do when I talk to these groups is I ask them, how do they get their news? And I say newspaper. And a lot of them don't get no surprise, get their news from a newspaper. Some of them get it from TV or radio. A lot of them get it from social media, right? Whether that's Snapchat or YouTube, Facebook and Twitter are the most common. But I think because they're used to consuming news on social media, that the line between opinion and fact has been blurred. And I think that's one of the things that is most confusing to people. If it's something as small as sharing a post on the main UT Twitter account that's a column, but we don't identify it as a column, then that reflects poorly, I think, on the organization, on us, because readers are assuming that that's a news story when it's Kevin Acee saying something solid about the Padres and making a very strong point. So I think that is one of the things that's kind of most important for us to do. And then I think also I'm curious to see always. I have this element of a slide where I give them headlines and I say, do you think this is real or fake? Mm-hmm. Dolly Parton says that 1 year of Trump is better than 16 years of Obama and Bush. Well, it sounds like it could be real, and so the point there is as we're teaching folks is how they can know what they're seeing is real or fake. And one of the things I'm really kind of delighted and excited to see is that people really love these tips that we're giving them, because they don't really know. I think we saw this in the last election. People share fake news so much, so frequently, that people are losing some ability to tell the difference between a real and a fake story. So I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of, and that people seem to really kind of get very excited about, because it gets increasingly difficult, even for journalists, to kind of know if you're clicking on something that's real or not. There's, ways to change your slug, ways to change the date of a story, and to make it look real. And that's, I think, an issue for all of us, whether it's at the Denver Post or at a Sinclair station or at the UT. Credibility has never been as important, I think, in journalism as it is right now.
Mm-hmm. And it does feel like we're at somewhat of a cultural moment right now with backlash against Facebook with the Cambridge Analytica scandal and just the ongoing national news events, that it appears that if journalists play the cards right, trust can be regained. Well, it has been lost over the past several decades.
Yeah. And I think it's we can do some things, but you mentioned Facebook. Facebook and Google control a lot of this, for better and for worse. And one of the things I just noticed in the last couple of days is if you see now on Facebook, when a news outlet is sharing a story, there's a little icon that pops up on it, and you can click on that for more information. And that's a thing that Facebook should have been doing a long time ago. Because then this is a legitimate outlet, this isn't. That helps you as a consumer know whether you're getting something that's real or fake or maybe satire, you know what I mean, which has its own place. And I think that it is an interesting moment. You have Zuckerberg going and testifying in front of Congress. There's an appetite, I think, among people. I used to always say that the news industry is having problems, but people's appetite for news is bigger than it's ever been. And that's a trend I only see increasing, you know what I mean? Because it's so much easier to share news, bad and good. And so the trick is to just try to figure out how to get more readers to realize, to empower them, which kind of sucks because it's a lot of work to consume news these days. It used to be, here's Walter Cronkite telling me what I should think about the world, and that's awesome, I trust him. And now there's a zillion ways to get news on different platforms. And so that's one of the things that we need to do collectively as an industry and with these tech firms to try to kind of empower. I keep using the word empower. I really think that's how it is. If you empower readers and listeners and viewers, then that's better for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And with a new owner, it's not like things are going to change overnight. There's going to be a period of transition as the details are worked out with with Tronk and with Patrick SoonShiong. So while we're in this kind of middle phase, what are some of the things you think that the UT could do locally to improve its coverage?
That's a great question. And Jeff Light should probably answer on the news side, but personally, I think there's some places where we could devote more resources, start different conversations. Like on the opinion side, we're looking to create a new online forum for op-eds that won't be tied to like the fact that there's only an op-ed section 4 out of 7 days of the week, and that we're tied to space constraints and time constraints. And so I think as one of the newspaper's central roles is fostering a kind of a smart community conversation. So that's one way that we can do it, and we're already starting to see in podcasts, not to get too meta here, but the Padres podcast that we've started, the Zahao podcast, like those are ways people, are listening and not just reading news now. They're finding different ways to do it. And we actually it's an election season, right? So here's one way that the UT is trying to increase trust and transparency. The editorial board, we have candidates kind of tromp through the building and they sit down with us for an hour or hour, 15 minutes or so. Very detailed kind of interviews. And before we would run edited transcripts in the paper as space allowed, which was okay, but I thought, well, why didn't we just share all of it? And so now we're putting full transcripts and full audio online. And that's really, I think people really are loving that, because if you want to listen to it, you can hear how candidate X or Y delivers their comments, whether they're informed or answering in halting ways or really up to speed, or the opposite, whether they don't really know what they're talking about. And that comes across differently in audio as it does when you read a full transcript. But the point being, we're sharing it, and it's not just in our ivory tower. We have access to these candidates. These are important positions that they're interviewing for. And so I think, again, it's incumbent on us to pull the curtain back a little bit and share. And so that's, I think, what generally our podcasts do, and our editorial board's approach, and maybe this op-ed section, and maybe some new teams or some different ways that we can get at the news. I think all of that are kind of medium steps we can take, because you're right, it's not going to be a change. We're not going to flick a switch when the new owner takes over and make it totally different. It's still going to be an evolution. And I hope readers and viewers and listeners are too.
Matt Hall, thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
As the Union-Tribune continues its transition to new ownership, now is the perfect time to let us know how you think we're doing. Following us on Facebook gives you the chance to interact with us on Facebook Live, and of course, subscribing, rating, and reviewing this podcast helps us too. Refocus is a part of the San Diego Union-Tribune podcasting network. Our team includes Laura Hockley, Lauren Flynn, and John Kelly. Special thanks to John Wilkins, Meg James, Robin Dixon, Scott Wilson, and Thomas Kerwin. I'm Daniel Wheaton. Until next time.